an original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Lydia Harrow stands at the edge of the dining room, teacup trembling in her hand, as the Dowager Duchess's question cuts through the morning silence like a blade. Across the table, Duke Edmund Langford sets down his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his jaw tightening as he meets his mother's unflinching gaze. No, he answers, the word landing between them like a stone dropped into still water. The Dowager leans forward slightly, her expression unreadable, and delivers her observation with surgical precision. Then, why have you said her name 4 times at breakfast? Lydia's breath catches. She had not known. Edmund's eyes flicker toward her for the briefest moment before returning to his mother. And in that instant, everything Lydia believed about her place in this house begins to unravel. Outside, morning light filters through tall windows, illuminating the porcelain and silver that suddenly feel like instruments of exposure rather than comfort. Lydia Harrow had learned the art of invisibility long before she arrived at Langford House. It was not a skill taught in drawing rooms or practiced among women of fortune. It was survival. A widow at 27, left without inheritance or protection, she had discovered that the world had little patience for women who existed between stations, too educated to serve in the kitchens, too poor to sit at the table, too proud to beg, too practical to refuse what was offered. Her position as companion to the Dowager Duchess of Langford had arrived through the intervention of the parish rector, a man who had known her late husband. The letter had been brief, the salary modest, the expectations clear. She would read aloud. She would write correspondence. She would accompany the Dowager on social calls. She would be present when required and absent when convenient. She would not presume. She would not intrude. She would not, under any circumstance, become a subject of gossip or speculation. Lydia had accepted without hesitation. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of mornings spent arranging letters by order of importance. 3 years of afternoons reading novels aloud in the conservatory, while the Dowager embroidered with silent concentration. 3 years of evenings, seated in the corner of the drawing room, her hands folded, her posture impeccable, her presence so carefully managed that guests often forgot she was there until they required something fetched or clarified. She had become a function, a piece of the household machinery, as essential and as unremarkable as the clock in the hall or the silver on the sideboard, and she had told herself this was enough. Langford House itself was a monument to reputation. Built in the late 17th century, it stood on the edge of the Derbyshire moors, its pale stone facade reflecting the changing light with austere beauty. Inside, every room had been arranged with the precision of a military campaign. Portraits lined the corridors. Furniture gleamed with beeswax and attention. Floors were swept twice daily. Fires were lit and tended according to a schedule that had not varied in decades. The household staff moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their livelihoods depended on discretion. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, ruled the domestic sphere with firm kindness. Mr. Pemberton, the steward, managed the estate accounts with meticulous care. The footmen spoke only when spoken to. The maids curtsied and vanished. Lydia occupied a strange middle ground. She was not family, but neither was she staff. She ate her meals in her own small sitting room, not in the servants' hall, and not at the family table. She dressed well enough to accompany the Dowager in public, but plainly enough to avoid drawing attention. She was educated, articulate, and utterly dependent. Her days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. She woke at 6. She dressed in gray or brown. She pinned her dark hair into a simple knot. She descended the back stairs to collect the morning correspondence before the Dowager rose. She sorted letters by sender, priority, and content. She prepared the Dowager's tea tray with the exact arrangement preferred. 2 slices of toast butter, but no jam. 1 boiled egg, china cup with the rose pattern. By 8, she was in the morning room, seated by the window with her needlework, or a book, waiting. The Dowager arrived at past. They reviewed the day's obligations. They discussed household matters. They read the newspapers together. The Dowager offering terse commentary on politics and society with the authority of someone who had once moved easily through both. Lydia listened. She agreed when appropriate. She offered no opinions unless asked. She had learned that her value lay not in her thoughts, but in her usefulness. And yet, despite the smallness she had cultivated, despite the careful erasure of her own desires, Lydia had not lost herself entirely. In the evenings, after the dowager retired, she returned to her sitting room and allowed herself an hour of freedom. She read poetry. She wrote letters to the rector's wife, the only friend from her former life, who still corresponded. She stood by the window and looked out over the moors, watching the light fade and the stars emerge, and she let herself remember what it had felt like to be seen. Her late husband had been kind. Their marriage had been brief, born of mutual respect rather than passion, but it had been honest. He had valued her mind. He had asked her opinions. He had laughed at her observations. And when he died, suddenly and without warning, Lydia had discovered that kindness was not inheritable. His family had offered nothing. The parish had offered sympathy, and the world had offered her a choice: remarry quickly or disappear. She had chosen a third path. She had chosen dignity. At Langford House, she had found a kind of peace. It was not happiness, but it was safety, and for a woman alone, safety was no small gift. She did not expect more. She had not imagined that more was possible. Until the morning when the dowager asked her question, and Edmund Langford's careful composure cracked, just enough to let the truth slip through. The dining room at Langford House was a study in restrained elegance. The table, long enough to seat 20, was set each morning for 3. The dowager at the head, Duke Edmund to her right, and an empty chair to her left that had once belonged to the late Duke, and now remained as a silent monument to continuity. The walls were papered in pale green silk. The ceiling was coffered and painted white. Tall windows overlooked the east garden, where roses grew in regimented beds and gravel paths curved with geometric precision. Lydia was not meant to be present during breakfast. Her duties began afterward, when the dowager required assistance with correspondence. But on this particular morning, the dowager had requested that Lydia retrieve a letter from the library before the meal concluded. A small task, a brief intrusion. Lydia had entered quietly, as she always did, moving along the periphery of the room toward the library door. She had not intended to listen. She had not intended to be noticed. But as she reached for the door handle, the dowager's voice stopped her. "Do you love her?" The question was not loud. It was not sharp. It was delivered with the same calm precision the dowager used to discuss the weather or the condition of the roses. But it landed in the room like a stone dropped into glass. Lydia froze. Edmund, seated with his back to her, did not move. His hand, which had been holding a piece of toast, remained suspended above his plate. His shoulders, always so carefully squared, seemed to stiffen. The dowager waited. She did not repeat herself. She simply waited, her gaze fixed on her son with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime extracting truth from silence. Finally, Edmund set down the toast. He folded his newspaper with deliberate care. He met his mother's eyes. "No," he said. The word was quiet, firm, final. The dowager tilted her head slightly. The way a bird might regard an insect, it was considering whether to consume. "Then why?" she said, her tone unchanged. "Have you said her name 4 times at breakfast?" Lydia felt the air leave her lungs. She had not known. She had not heard. Edmund's jaw tightened. For a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable. "I was not aware," he said carefully, "that I had done so." "You were not aware," the dowager repeated. "How interesting." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of implication, full of observation, full of the kind of truth that could not be unsaid once spoken. Lydia's hand tightened on the door handle. She wanted to leave. She wanted to vanish. But she could not move without drawing attention, and attention was the last thing she could afford. Edmund's gaze flickered, just for an instant, toward the library door, toward her. Their eyes met. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that brief, suspended moment, Lydia saw something she had not allowed herself to recognize before. Something she had mistaken for courtesy, for kindness, for the polite acknowledgement a duke might offer to any member of his household. But it was not that. It was recognition, and then he looked away. "I will be more mindful," he said to his mother, his voice carefully neutral, "of my speech." The dowager picked up her teacup. She took a slow sip. She set it down again, with a soft clink of porcelain against saucer. "See that you are," she said. And that was all. Lydia forced herself to move. She opened the library door. She retrieved the letter. She returned through the dining room without looking at either of them. Her hands did not shake. Her expression did not change. She had spent 3 years learning how to carry herself through rooms, as though she were not really there. But as she climbed the stairs to the dowager's sitting room, letter in hand, her heart was beating so loudly, she was certain the entire household could hear it. He had said her name 4 times, without realizing. And now the dowager knew. Now Edmund knew that the dowager knew. And Lydia, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being seen, suddenly felt as though she were standing in the center of a stage, illuminated by a light she could not escape. The change was immediate. Edmund did not avoid her, precisely. He did not treat her with coldness or disdain. But where before there had been small courtesies, a nod in the corridor, a brief question about a book she was reading, a moment of shared silence in the library, there was now distance. He no longer lingered in rooms where she was present. He no longer asked her opinion, however casually, on matters of estate business that the dowager discussed in her hearing. He no longer met her eyes. It was not cruelty. It was protection. Lydia understood this. She understood that Edmund believed he was shielding her from speculation, from gossip, from the kind of attention that could ruin a woman in her position. A companion who became the subject of rumor was a companion who would be dismissed, not with malice, not with anger, but with regret and a letter of reference and the quiet, polite erasure that society reserved for women who forgot their place. Edmund was protecting her reputation, but in doing so, he was also confirming what the dowager had already observed. The household noticed. Servants always noticed. They noticed the way the Duke's gaze no longer followed Mrs. Harrow when she crossed the hall. They noticed the way he took his tea in the study, rather than the drawing room. They noticed the way conversations ended when she entered a room. Not because she was unwelcome, but because her presence had become a subject that required careful navigation. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, said nothing, but her eyes, when they met Lydia's, held a quiet sympathy. Mr. Pemberton, the steward, remained professionally distant, as always. The maids whispered. Lydia felt the shift like a change in air pressure before a storm. She had been invisible. Now she was visible in the worst possible way. She was a question, a complication, a problem that required solving. She began to prepare herself. She checked her references. She reviewed her savings, meager as they were. She rehearsed the words she would say when the dowager called her into the sitting room and explained, with perfect courtesy, that a position had been found for her elsewhere. A household in Scotland, perhaps, or the north, somewhere far enough away that her departure would not require explanation. She did not blame Edmund. She did not blame the dowager. She blamed herself for the sin of being noticed. In the evenings, alone in her sitting room, she allowed herself a small, private grief. Not for love lost. She had never allowed herself to believe that love was possible, but for the loss of safety, for the loss of the quiet, predictable life she had built. For the loss of the one place where she had felt, if not valued, then at least secure. She had been foolish to think it could last. She had been foolish to think she could remain invisible forever. Meanwhile, Edmund wrestled with his own discipline. He told himself that distance was kindness, that silence was respect, that to name what he felt would be to transform it into obligation. He was a duke. She was a widow, without family or fortune. His regard, if spoken, would not be a gift. It would be a cage. He could not offer her marriage. The scandal would be immediate and unforgiving. A duke did not marry his mother's companion. Society would call it infatuation, madness, a lapse in judgment. His mother would be humiliated. Lydia would be blamed. And even if he defied convention, even if he offered her his name and his protection, what kind of life would that be? She would be forever marked as the woman who had risen above her station. Every drawing room would whisper. Every social gathering would judge. She would be isolated, resented, reduced to the role of the Duke's unsuitable wife. He could not do that to her, so he did nothing. He withdrew. He convinced himself that his silence was a form of love. But silence, he would learn, could be its own cruelty. The dowager's spring gathering was not a grand affair. It was too calculated for that. 30 guests carefully selected from the local gentry and neighboring estates, women whose opinions carried weight. Men whose approval mattered. Families whose daughters were of marriageable age, and whose presence served as a reminder that Edmund, at 34, remained unmarried and without an heir. The gathering was ostensibly a celebration of the season. In truth, it was an exercise in control. Lydia understood her role. She was to be present, but unobtrusive. She was to pour tea. She was to fetch shawls and fans. She was to ensure that the dowager's guests were attended to, without requiring the dowager herself to manage the small, tedious details of hospitality. She dressed in a gown of soft gray, high-necked and plain. She pinned her hair with care. She descended to the drawing room and took her position near the tea service, her hands folded, her expression composed. The guests arrived in a rustle of silk and murmured greetings. Lydia moved among them with practiced efficiency, offering tea, remembering preferences, smiling politely at remarks that were not quite directed at her. She had done this 100 times before, but today the air felt different. Mrs. Ashford, the wife of a neighboring baronet, accepted her tea with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How fortunate the dowager is," she said, her voice light, "to have such devoted assistants." Lydia inclined her head. "You are kind to say so. And how long have you been at Langford House, Mrs. Harrow?" 3 years, ma'am." 3 years. How time passes." Mrs. Ashford took a delicate sip. "And do you find the position agreeable?" "Very much so." "I imagine it must be difficult," Mrs. Ashford continued, her tone still pleasant, "to be so essential to the household. One would not wish to become indispensable. It can be so very awkward when circumstances change." Lydia understood the message. She smiled. "I serve at the dowager's pleasure," she said quietly, "as do we all." Mrs. Ashford's smile sharpened. "Indeed." Across the room, Edmund stood near the window, engaged in conversation with Mr. Ashford and 2 other gentlemen. He did not look at Lydia. He did not look at anyone, really. He was performing the role of host with the same careful precision. She was performing the role of companion. But Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when Mrs. Ashford's daughter, a pretty young woman with fair curls and an eager smile, approached him with a question about the gardens. The dowager, seated in her customary chair, observed it all with the calm attention of a general surveying a battlefield. By the time the guests departed, Lydia's hands ached from pouring tea, and her feet throbbed from standing. She retreated to the small parlor adjacent to the drawing room, intending to rest for a moment before returning to her duties. She did not expect Mrs. Calloway to follow. The housekeeper entered quietly, closing the door behind her. In her hands, she carried something unusual, a leather-bound ledger, the kind used for estate accounts. "Mrs. Harrow," she said, her voice low, "there is something you should know." Lydia looked up, surprised. Mrs. Calloway was not given to unnecessary conversation. If she had sought Lydia out, it was for a reason. "What is it?" Lydia asked. Mrs. Calloway set the ledger on the table and opened it to a marked page. "This," she said simply. Lydia leaned forward. The page was filled with neat, precise handwriting, columns of figures, allocations of funds, and at the top, a heading, "Provision for Widows of Clergy, Permanent Estate Policy." Lydia's breath caught. "This was established 6 years ago," Mrs. Calloway said quietly. 3 years before you arrived. His Grace insisted it be recorded formally, not as charity, as policy." Lydia's eyes moved down the page. The provision was modest, but sufficient, enough to provide a small income, enough to prevent destitution, enough to offer dignity. "Why are you showing me this?" Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Calloway met her gaze. "Because you should know that his care for you did not begin with affection," she said. "It began with principle. And principle, Mrs. Harrow, is a far more reliable foundation than sentiment." Lydia stared at the ledger. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the edge of the page. Edmund had done this, not for her specifically, but for women like her, women who had been left vulnerable, women who had no one to protect them. He had built a structure of care into the estate itself. He had made it policy. He had ensured that it would continue regardless of his personal feelings or presence. It was not romance. It was something deeper. It was justice. "Thank you," Lydia said softly. Mrs. Calloway nodded. She closed the ledger and left as quietly as she had come, and Lydia sat alone in the small parlor, staring at the closed door, and understood for the first time that Edmund's silence had never been indifference. It had been restraint, and restraint, she realized, could be its own form of devotion. The Dowager made her suggestion 3 days later. It was delivered over breakfast, in the same calm, measured tone she used for all matters of household management. "I have been thinking, Lydia," she said, setting down her teacup, "that you might be happier in a different situation." Lydia's hands stilled on her napkin. She had been expecting this. She had prepared herself for it. But hearing the words still felt like a door closing. "I have corresponded with Lady Pemberton in Northumberland," the Dowager continued. "She is in need of a companion. The position would be very similar to your current role. The salary is comparable, and the household, I am told, is quite pleasant." Lydia kept her expression neutral. "That is very kind of you to arrange, Your Grace. I thought it might be best," the Dowager said, her gaze steady, "given the circumstances." The circumstances. The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Lydia nodded. "Of course, you have been an exemplary companion," the Dowager said. "I will provide you with the highest recommendation. You need not worry about your future." "Thank you, Your Grace." The Dowager picked up her teacup again. "You may take a few days to consider the offer, but I would appreciate a decision by the end of the week." "Yes, Your Grace." Lydia rose. She curtsied. She left the room with the same composed dignity she had maintained for 3 years. But as she climbed the stairs to her sitting room, she felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a shroud. She would accept the position in Northumberland. She would leave Langford House. She would disappear, as she had always known she would, and the household would continue without her. And in time, no one would remember that she had ever been there, except Edmund. And that, she thought, was the cruelest part of all. Edmund learned of his mother's arrangement that same afternoon. Mr. Pemberton, in his usual efficient manner, mentioned it while reviewing estate correspondence. "The Dowager has made inquiries on Mrs. Harrow's behalf," he said. "A position in Northumberland. Lady Pemberton's household." Edmund's hand stilled on the document he was signing. "When was this arranged?" "This week, Your Grace. I believe Mrs. Harrow has been given until Friday to respond." Edmund set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair. He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "Thank you, Pemberton. That will be all." The steward bowed and withdrew. Edmund sat alone in his study, staring at the papers on his desk without seeing them. He had told himself that distance was protection. He had told himself that silence was kindness. He had told himself that his regard, if spoken, would trap her. But his silence had trapped her anyway. His mother had seen what he had tried to hide, and now, in her careful, methodical way, she was solving the problem. Not with cruelty, not with anger, but with efficiency. Lydia would be sent away. She would be given a respectable position, a good reference, a future, and Edmund would remain here, in this house, in this life, surrounded by duty and expectation, and the quiet, relentless weight of a title he had never wanted. He thought of the ledger, the provision he had established years ago, long before Lydia arrived. He had done it because it was right, because he had seen too many women left destitute by circumstance, because he believed that power carried responsibility. But responsibility, he realized now, was not the same as courage. He had built structures of care. He had created policies. He had ensured that women like Lydia would not be abandoned. But he had not fought for her. He had not spoken. He had let fear and propriety, and the suffocating weight of expectation, dictate his silence. And now she would leave, unless he acted. Edmund rose from his desk. He crossed to the window and looked out over the estate, the gardens, the fields, the tenants' cottages in the distance, all of it his responsibility, all of it his burden. But what was the point of power, he thought, if it could not be used to protect what mattered? What was the point of authority if it served only to preserve appearances? He had spent his entire life governing with caution, with restraint, with the careful, measured discipline expected of a duke. But caution, he realized, could be its own cowardice. He turned from the window. He made his decision. The registry room was rarely used. It was a small, windowless chamber on the ground floor, lined with shelves of ledgers and legal documents. The estate's administrative heart. A place where decisions were recorded, policies established, and the machinery of the household made official. Edmund summoned a meeting there the following morning. Present, Mr. Pemberton, the steward, Mr. Dawson, the estate rector, Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, and Lydia Harrow. The Dowager was not invited. Lydia entered last, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying confusion. She took her place near the door, as though ready to leave at the first opportunity. Edmund stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. "I have called you here," he said, his voice calm but firm, "to formalize a matter of estate policy." He gestured to the ledger, open before him. The same ledger Mrs. Calloway had shown Lydia days earlier. 6 years ago, Edmund continued, I established a provision for widows of clergy. It was intended as permanent policy, embedded in the estate's governance. However, I have come to realize that the provision, while well-intentioned, lacks sufficient oversight and authority. He turned a page. Effective immediately, the widow's provision will be expanded. It will include not only financial support, but also housing and employment opportunities within the estate. Furthermore, ceremonial household expenditures, those allocated to social events and decorative purposes, will be reduced by 15%. Those funds will be redirected to the provision. Mr. Pemberton made a note. Mr. Dawson nodded approvingly. Mrs. Calloway's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with understanding. Lydia stood very still. Edmund looked up. He met her gaze. This is not charity, he said quietly. It is justice, and it is my responsibility as the steward of this estate to ensure that those who serve it, in whatever capacity, are protected. He closed the ledger. Mr. Pemberton, please record these changes in the estate register. Mr. Dawson, I will require your assistance in identifying widows within the parish who may benefit. Mrs. Calloway, I trust you will oversee the practical implementation. All three nodded. That will be all, Edmund said, except for Mrs. Harrow. I would like a word. The others filed out quietly. The door closed, and for the first time in weeks, Edmund and Lydia were alone. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was full. Edmund did not move from his place at the table. Lydia remained near the door, her hands folded, her posture perfect. I repeated your name, Edmund said finally. 4 times. At breakfast, Lydia's breath caught. I was not aware I had done so, he continued. But my mother was correct. I had. He paused. I have spent the past 3 weeks attempting to protect you from speculation, from gossip, from the kind of attention that could harm your position. I believed that distance was kindness, that silence was respect. He looked at her directly. I was wrong. Lydia's hands tightened on each other. My silence, Edmund said quietly, was not protection. It was cowardice. I told myself that my regard for you would trap you, that my position made honesty a form of possession. But in my silence, I allowed my mother to arrange your departure. I allowed you to believe that you were unwelcome. I allowed fear to govern me. He took a slow breath. I do not wish you to leave, he said, but I will not ask you to stay unless you understand why. Lydia's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. I repeated your name, Edmund said, because you have become essential to my thoughts, not as a companion, not as a function of this household, but as yourself, as the woman who reads poetry in the evening, who speaks with kindness to the kitchen maids, who carries herself with dignity even when the world offers her none. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them by half. I cannot offer you a life without difficulty, he said. Society will judge. My mother will resist. There will be whispers and speculation and cruelty, but I can offer you honesty and partnership and the promise that I will never again allow fear to silence what matters. He held out his hand. In it, a pen. This is not a contract, he said quietly. It is a choice. If you take it, you are choosing to stay, not as my mother's companion, but as my equal, as my partner, as the woman I wish to build a life with. Lydia looked at the pen, then at him, and then slowly she reached out, but she did not take the pen. Instead, she closed the ledger. I do not need a contract, she said softly. I need your word. Edmund's throat tightened. You have it, he said. And then, with the same deliberate care he had shown in every action since the morning his mother had asked her question, Edmund took Lydia's hand. He lifted it to his lips. He kissed it, not quickly, not casually, but slowly, reverently, as though it were the most important gesture he would ever make. Lydia's eyes closed. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer invisible. She was seen. The following morning, the household gathered for breakfast as usual. The dining room looked the same. The table was set with the same porcelain, the same silver, the same flowers arranged in the same crystal vase. But everything had changed. The dowager sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Edmund sat to her right, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. And to her left, in the chair that had remained empty for years, sat Lydia Harrow. She wore a gown of pale blue. Her hair was pinned simply. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. The dowager said nothing. Edmund poured coffee with deliberate calm. He turned to Lydia. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Tea or coffee?" Her name rested naturally in the air. No explanation, no defense, just presence. Lydia met his gaze. She smiled. "Tea, please," she said quietly. Edmund poured. He handed her the cup. Their fingers brushed. The dowager adjusted her napkin. She took a sip of her own tea. She said nothing, but her silence was not approval. It was acceptance. Mrs. Calloway entered to refill the teapot. She glanced at Lydia, and the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips before she withdrew. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the room. Outside, the gardens were in full bloom. Birds sang. The estate continued its rhythms. And inside, at the breakfast table, 3 people sat together in a silence that was no longer heavy. It was simply morning. Lydia lifted her teacup. The porcelain was warm against her palms. She took a slow sip, savoring the taste, the moment, the quiet miracle of being present, without apology. She thought of the woman she had been 3 years ago. The widow who had arrived at Langford House with nothing but a single trunk and a desperate need for safety. She thought of the woman she had become, the companion who had learned to disappear. And she thought of the woman she was now, seen, acknowledged, chosen. Not because she had transformed herself into something acceptable, but because someone had chosen to see her as she was. Edmund reached for the newspaper. He unfolded it with the same measured care he brought to everything. But before he began reading, he glanced at Lydia. Just a glance, but it was enough. The dowager set down her teacup with a soft clink. "I have correspondence to attend to," she said, rising. "Edmund, I trust you will review the tenant petitions this afternoon." "I will," Edmund said. "Lydia will assist me." The dowager paused. For a moment, she looked at her son, and at Lydia. "Very well," she said, and she left. The door closed behind her. Edmund and Lydia sat alone at the long table, sunlight warming the room, the estate waking around them. "She will come to accept it," Edmund said quietly. "Perhaps," Lydia said. "Or perhaps she will simply tolerate it. Either way, I am here." "You are," Edmund agreed. He reached across the table. Not far, just enough. His hand rested near hers, not touching, but close. Lydia looked at their hands, at the space between them, at the choice that space represented. And then, with the same quiet courage that had brought her this far, she closed the distance. Her fingers brushed his. He turned his hand. Their palms met. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped on the table, the morning light spilling over them, the household moving quietly through its routines beyond the closed door. And Lydia thought, this is what it means to be loved, not rescued, not possessed, but seen, acknowledged, chosen. She had spent 3 years learning to disappear. Now she was learning to remain. And it was the bravest thing she had ever done. Autumn came to Langford House with the same quiet inevitability. As all seasons, the roses faded. The gardens turned gold and amber. The moors beyond the estate stretched out beneath skies heavy with rain and wind. Inside, the household adjusted. Lydia no longer occupied the small sitting room on the 2nd floor. She had been given a suite of rooms adjacent to the family wing. Not the Duchess's chambers. Those remained closed, a monument to memory. But rooms that were hers. Rooms with windows that looked out over the gardens. Rooms with a writing desk and bookshelves, and a fireplace that was tended daily. She no longer poured tea for guests. She sat at the table with them. She no longer read aloud to the dowager in the afternoons. She reviewed tenant petitions with Edmund. She corresponded with the estate rector regarding the widow's fund, which had quietly expanded to include 3 additional families. She visited the tenants' cottages with Mrs. Calloway, listening to concerns, making notes, ensuring that the policies Edmund had established were implemented with care and fairness. She became, in the quiet, unglamorous way that true partnership required, essential, not as decoration, not as convenience, but as counsel. The dowager did not warm to her, but she no longer opposed her. She observed, she adjusted, and in her own measured way, she made space. One afternoon, as Lydia sat in the library reviewing correspondence, the dowager entered. Lydia rose immediately, but the Dowager waved her back into her seat. "I have been thinking," the Dowager said, her tone as calm as ever, "about the tenant school." Lydia waited. "It has been neglected," the Dowager continued. "The building is sound, but the curriculum is outdated. The teacher is elderly and will retire soon." She paused. "I believe it would benefit from your attention." Lydia blinked. "Mine. You are a rector's wife," the Dowager said. "You understand education. You understand the needs of the parish. And you have Edmund's trust." She met Lydia's gaze. "You also have mine." It was not affection, but it was respect. And for the Dowager, respect was a far greater gift. "Thank you, Your Grace," Lydia said quietly. The Dowager inclined her head. "See that it is done well," and she left. Lydia sat alone in the library, staring at the closed door, and felt something shift inside her. She had been seen. She had been acknowledged. And now she was being trusted. It was more than she had ever imagined. On a cold November morning, Lydia and Edmund walked together through the estate gardens. The roses were gone. The beds had been cleared for winter. The gravel paths crunched softly beneath their feet. They did not speak. They did not need to. Edmund's hand brushed hers as they walked. She took it. They stopped near the low stone wall that bordered the east garden. Beyond it, the moors stretched out, dark and wild beneath a sky heavy with clouds. "I have been thinking," Edmund said quietly, "about names." Lydia glanced at him. "I repeated yours 4 times at breakfast," he continued, without realizing. "Because you had already become part of my thoughts, part of my world." He turned to face her. "I would like," he said, "to say your name every day for the rest of my life. Not unconsciously, but deliberately, as a choice." Lydia's breath caught. "Will you marry me?" Edmund asked. The question was simple, direct, honest. Lydia looked at him. At the man who had built structures of care before he had ever known her, who had chosen justice over convenience, who had risked scandal and his mother's disapproval to offer her not rescue, but partnership. "Yes," she said. Edmund smiled. It was a rare expression, but when it came, it transformed his face. He lifted her hand to his lips. He kissed it, just as he had in the registry room months before. And then, for the first time, he kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was slow, deliberate, full of promise. When they pulled apart, Lydia rested her forehead against his. "I was invisible," she whispered. "You were never invisible," Edmund said. "I simply had to learn how to see." They stood together in the garden, the wind cold around them, the sky gray above, and Lydia thought, this is what it means to be loved. Not the absence of power, but the choice to wield it justly. She had spent 3 years disappearing. Now she was learning to remain, and she would never be invisible again. Spring returned. The gardens bloomed. The moors turned green. The household settled into new rhythms. Lydia Langford, no longer Harrow, sat at the breakfast table beside her husband, reviewing the morning correspondence. The Dowager sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper with her customary focus. Edmund poured coffee. He glanced at Lydia. "Lydia," he said, "the rector has requested a meeting about the school." "I will arrange it," she said. Her name, spoken once, rested naturally in the room. No repetition, no unconscious betrayal, just presence. The Dowager turned a page of her newspaper. "The roses are blooming early this year," she observed. "They are," Edmund agreed. Lydia smiled. Outside, the estate woke. Tenants worked the fields. Children played near the cottages. The household staff moved through their duties with the same quiet efficiency they always had. But within the walls of Langford House, something fundamental had changed. Not revolution, transformation, not rescue, recognition. Lydia had learned that love was not the absence of power. It was the choice to wield it justly. And in that choice, she had found not safety, but freedom. She reached for her teacup. Edmund's hand rested near hers on the table. The Dowager glanced at them, then returned to her newspaper. Morning light filled the room, and Lydia, who had once been invisible, was finally, irrevocably seen.